At 5:42 a.m. on September 15, 1944, Chief Boatswain's mate Robert Hendricks stood at the helm of LST 512, watching tracers arc across the dark water toward his bow. 3 miles off Peleliu's white beach, he could see the orange flashes of Japanese shore batteries. Behind him, 2,000 Marines crouched between 50 Sherman tanks stacked 3 levels high across his deck. The LST rocked hard to port. Water crashed over the ramp. Hendricks knew what every other Navy man knew. An LST carried 350 troops, maybe 20 tanks if you pushed it. His ship carried 6 times that. The Japanese had watched his vessel approach for 40 minutes. They'd counted 1 LST, just 1. They'd adjusted their defensive fire accordingly. They had no idea what was about to hit their beach. Hendricks gripped the wheel tighter. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. He'd been loading this ship for 19 hours straight, against direct orders, against naval regulations, against the advice of every officer who'd seen what he was doing. But the Marines on White Beach were dying. Supplies weren't getting through, and Hendricks had figured out how to fix it. If he didn't get court-martialed first, Robert Hendricks was 28 years old, a dockworker's son from Brooklyn who'd spent his entire life loading ships at the Red Hook piers. Before the war, he'd worked for the Luckenbach Steamship Company. 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, loading cargo into holds that engineers said couldn't possibly fit another crate. His father had taught him the tricks: weight distribution, rigging angles, how to stack heavy loads without crushing what's underneath. The Navy had made him a boatswain's mate in 1942, sent him to LST training at Camp Bradford in Virginia. He'd expected to learn seamanship. Instead, they taught him to drive a 328-foot steel box with a flat bottom. No keel, no real rudder control, just a massive floating warehouse with a ramp on the front. LSTs were designed for one thing: get tanks and trucks and troops onto enemy beaches, drive straight in, drop the ramp, unload, get out. By July 1944, Hendricks had made 11 landings: Guam, Saipan, Tinian. Each time, the same problem. Not enough ships, not enough trips. Marines hitting beaches and running out of ammunition before the second wave arrived. He'd lost count of how many supply runs he'd made to beachheads under fire, waiting offshore while the first wave died, listening to radio chatter from Marines pinned down, screaming for ammunition, for water, for reinforcements, and the LSTs could only carry 350 men at a time. The math didn't work. 5 LSTs making 3 trips each meant 5,250 Marines on the beach in the first 6 hours. But the Japanese knew the pattern. They timed their counterattacks for the gaps between landings, for those 40-minute windows when the LSTs were heading back for more troops. That's when Marines died. Hendricks had watched it happen at Saipan. Second wave landed at 09:20. Marines pushed 200 yards inland. LSTs turned around for the third wave. At 10:15, Japanese Type 95 tanks came out of the jungle. The Marines had bazookas. They had rifles. They didn't have their own Shermans yet, because the tank LSTs were still 30 minutes offshore. 17 Marines died in 4 minutes. Hendricks knew most of their names. He'd transported them that morning. He'd talked to them on the way in. A corporal from Chicago had asked him about Brooklyn, asked if Ebbets Field was really as small as it looked in photos. Corporal James Mitchell, 22 years old, Cicero, Illinois. The Type 95's 37mm gun had hit him in the chest. Hendricks had helped load his body bag onto an LST heading back to the fleet. 3 days after Saipan, another Marine had died because the supplies couldn't get through fast enough. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, 25, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Steel mill worker before the war. Kowalski's platoon had taken a Japanese bunker complex at 14:30 hours, used up every grenade they had, every satchel charge. They were waiting for resupply. The LSTs were making their 4th run of the day. The Japanese counterattacked at 14:45. Kowalski's men had rifles but no grenades. The bunker system connected underground. Japanese soldiers came up through tunnels behind them. 15 minutes. That's how long Kowalski held them off with just rifles. 15 minutes until the LST landed with fresh ammunition. He died at 14:58, 2 minutes before the grenades arrived. Hendricks had helped unload those grenade crates, had carried them up the beach, had walked past Kowalski's body still lying in the sand. That was July 21st, 1944. Hendricks stopped sleeping well after that. He'd lie in his rack aboard LST 512, running numbers in his head, calculating capacity, weight distribution, deck space, hold space. An LST could carry 2,100 tons of cargo. The Navy said 350 troops because of life support, fresh water, food, bunks, ventilation. But Hendricks had grown up watching his father load 200-ton cargo holds in Brooklyn, watching longshoremen stack crates floor to ceiling when the shipping company needed to make a deadline. There was always more room than the engineers thought. You just had to know how to use it. On August 3rd, Hendricks made a sketch, showed how you could stack tanks on the main deck, the tank deck, and in the hold if you reinforced the deck plating. Showed how you could fit troops in every gap between the tanks. Standing room only. No bunks, no hot food, but alive. He showed the sketch to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander William Pearson. Pearson had looked at it for maybe 20 seconds. "Chief, this vessel is rated for 350 combat-loaded troops or 20 tanks. That's naval regulation. That's what the engineers designed it for. I'm not overloading this ship and risking it breaking apart in rough seas." Hendricks had tried to argue, pointed out that most landings happened in calm water, pointed out that the deck could handle more weight if you distributed it correctly. Pearson had cut him off. "This conversation is over. We follow regulations." Dismissed. That was August 3rd. Between August 3rd and September 14th, LST 512 made 7 more supply runs. Standard capacity, 350 Marines per trip. Hendricks kept listening to the radio chatter from the beachheads, kept hearing the same thing. Not enough supplies, not enough reinforcements, not enough time between waves. And he kept sketching, calculating, figuring out exactly how much an LST could really carry. By September 14th, he had it figured out. He just needed someone to give him permission to try it. The problem wasn't the LSTs. The problem was the math. A Marine rifle company needed 47 tons of supplies per day in combat, ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies. 47 tons. An LST could carry 2,100 tons total. That sounded like a lot. But once you loaded 350 Marines, their equipment, their weapons, and their immediate combat load, you'd used 890 tons of capacity. That left 1,210 tons for vehicles and additional supplies, which meant roughly 20 Sherman tanks at 60,000 pounds each, plus ammunition for those tanks, plus fuel. The math worked fine if you had unlimited LSTs and unlimited time. The Pacific Theater had neither. In September 1944, the Navy had 1,051 LSTs total, but they were spread across 2 oceans: European Theater, Pacific Theater, Mediterranean, Training Command, Repair Yards. The Peleliu invasion had 26 LSTs assigned, 26 ships to land 28,000 Marines and soldiers, plus all their equipment, plus continuing supply once the beachhead was established. Navy planners had calculated it would take 18 hours to get the first wave fully supplied and reinforced. 18 hours of LSTs shuttling back and forth from the transport ships offshore to the beach. The Japanese had different plans. Their intelligence knew the LST numbers, knew the capacity limits, knew exactly how long the gaps would be between American landing waves. Japanese commanders on Peleliu had orders to let the first wave land. Let them push inland, then hit them during the supply gap. When the Marines were low on ammunition and the LSTs were heading back for the second wave, it had worked at Tarawa, it had worked at Saipan, it had almost worked at Guam, and it would work at Peleliu unless something changed. Hendricks knew all this because he'd sat in on the pre-invasion briefings. Boatswain's mates weren't usually invited, but his CO, Lieutenant Commander Pearson, had brought him along to answer technical questions about deck capacity. The planning officer, a Navy captain named Morrison, had laid it out clearly. We have 26 LSTs. We need to land 1,500 Marines in the first wave, along with 30 Sherman tanks for armor support. That's 5 LSTs for troops, 2 for tanks. They'll land at H-hour 8:30. Unload time is 12 minutes if the beach isn't contested. We estimate 20 minutes under fire. The LSTs will return to the transport area, reload, and make a second run. Estimated time for turnaround 47 minutes. Second wave lands at approximately 9:45. Morrison had paused there. He'd looked around the room. There will be a 75-minute gap between when the first wave lands and when the second wave arrives with ammunition resupply. During that gap, the Marines will be on their combat load only, approximately 200 rounds per rifleman. 4 grenades, 2 magazines for each bar. Someone had asked what happens if the Japanese counterattack during that gap. Morrison's answer had been blunt. The Marines hold, or they die. That's why we're landing tanks with the first wave. But Hendricks had done the math in his head. 30 Sherman tanks to support 2,500 Marines across a beach landing zone that would stretch 800 yards. That was 1 tank for every 50 Marines. 1 tank for every 27 yards of beach. It wasn't enough. The Japanese had Type 95 tanks, Type 97 tanks, and heavy artillery hidden in fortified caves. The intelligence report said at least 80 Japanese armored vehicles on Peleliu. 30 American tanks versus 80 Japanese. And if the American tanks got knocked out in the first hour, the Marines would have no armor support until the third wave arrived. That's when Hendricks had raised his hand. Captain Morrison, sir. What if we could get more tanks and more Marines onto the beach in the first wave? Morrison had looked at him like he was insane. Chief, we're already using every available LST. Unless you've got more ships hidden somewhere, we're working with what we have. Hendricks had opened his mouth to explain his idea. Lieutenant Commander Pearson had grabbed his arm. Hard. The chief was just thinking out loud, "Sir, disregard." After the briefing, Pearson had pulled Hendricks aside, told him to keep his mouth shut, told him the plan was set, told him to do his job and drive the ship. That had been September 11th. On September 12th, Hendricks watched another supply shortage kill Marines. It wasn't at Peleliu yet. It was at a tiny island called Angaur, 7 miles south, a smaller landing, just a proving run before the main assault. LST 512 had been part of the supply convoy. They'd carried 350 Marines in. Standard load. The landing had gone well at first. Marines hit the beach at 0817, light resistance. They'd pushed 400 yards inland by Aero 900. The LST turned around, headed back for more troops. At Aero 923, the Japanese had opened up with everything they had. Artillery from hidden positions, machine gun fire from bunkers the Marines hadn't spotted, a counterattack with 200 infantry coming out of the jungle. The Marines had radioed for immediate resupply. They were burning through ammunition faster than anyone had planned. The LSTs were 35 minutes away, loaded with the second wave. But 35 minutes might as well have been 35 hours. Hendricks had listened to the radio traffic, listened to a lieutenant screaming that his platoon was down to 40 rounds per man, listened to the calm voice of a captain saying they were about to be overrun. At Aero 941, the radio had gone silent. When LST 512 landed with the second wave at Aero 956, there were 23 dead Marines on the beach. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, 27, Boston, Massachusetts, died holding a machine gun position with no ammunition left. Private First Class David Chen, 19, San Francisco, California, died trying to retrieve ammunition from a destroyed supply dump. Corporal William Bill Jackson, 24, Atlanta, Georgia, died covering the withdrawal of his squad when they ran out of grenades. Hendricks had helped carry their bodies onto LST 417 for transport back to the fleet. That was September 12th. That night, he'd gone to Lieutenant Commander Pearson's quarters, knocked on the door, asked to speak privately. Pearson had let him in, but his expression made it clear this conversation wasn't welcome. "Sir, I've calculated a way to triple our carrying capacity. We can get 2,000 Marines and 50 tanks onto this ship if we modify the loading procedure. Pearson had held up a hand. Chief, we've been through this. The ship is rated for 350 troops. Naval regulations are clear. Sir, the regulations are written for normal transport conditions. This isn't normal transport. These are 40-minute runs to a hostile beach. We don't need bunks. We don't need hot food service. We just need to get bodies and tanks onto the sand. And what happens if we overload and the ship breaks apart? What happens if the deck plating fails and we dump 50 tanks into the ocean? What happens when I have to explain to Admiral Fort why I violated naval regulations and killed 2,000 Marines in the process? Hendricks had tried a different approach. Sir, I grew up loading ships in Brooklyn. My father was a stevedore for 30 years. I know how to distribute weight. I know how to rig heavy loads. This will work. Your father loaded cargo ships in peacetime, Chief. He didn't load combat vessels heading into enemy fire. There's a difference. The difference is 23 Marines died yesterday because we couldn't get supplies to them fast enough. Pearson's face had hardened. Those Marines died because of Japanese bullets, not because of LST capacity. This conversation is over. You will load this vessel to regulation standards. That is a direct order. Am I understood? Yes, sir. Good. Dismissed. Hendricks had saluted and left. But that night, lying in his rack, he'd made a decision. On September 13th, LST 5112 had been assigned to transport duty, ferrying supplies from Guadalcanal to the staging area near Peleliu. It was a 300-mile run with no combat loading required. Pearson had taken the opportunity to go ashore at Guadalcanal for a supply officers' meeting. He'd left Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Webster in command. Webster was 23 years old, fresh out of the Naval Academy. He'd been aboard LST 512 for exactly 11 days. Hendricks had watched Pearson's boat pull away from the ship. Then he'd gone to find Webster. Sir, we've been ordered to load supplies for the Peleliu assault. I need authorization to modify the deck rigging system to increase capacity. Webster had barely looked up from his paperwork. Whatever you need, Chief. You're the boatswain's mate. Deck loading is your department. That was all the authorization Hendricks needed. He'd started loading at 1400 hours on September 13th. By 0900 hours on September 14th, he'd loaded 2,000 Marines and 50 Sherman tanks onto LST 512. The thing that pushed Hendricks over the edge wasn't an order. It was a conversation. On the afternoon of September 13th, while Pearson was still ashore, Hendricks had been walking the dock at Guadalcanal when he'd run into Gunnery Sergeant Vincent Hayes. Hayes was 32, career Marine, had fought at Guadalcanal in 1942, at Tarawa in 1943. He'd survived both. Barely. He was scheduled to land in the first wave at Peleliu the next morning. Chief Hendricks, you driving the bus tomorrow? That's the plan, Gunny. LST 512 at 0530. Hayes had nodded, lit a cigarette. His hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. Let me ask you something, Chief. You've been doing this for a while. You've seen how it goes. First wave hits the beach. Second wave is 70 minutes behind. That sound about right? Closer to 75 minutes if the beach is hot. Right. 75 minutes. Hayes had taken a long drag. That's how long we've got to hold with what we're carrying. Combat load only. 200 rounds. 4 grenades. Maybe a satchel charge if we're lucky. Hendricks hadn't said anything. The Japs know the timing, Chief. They've been fighting us for 3 years. They know exactly how long between our waves. They wait for that gap. That's when they hit us. I know. So here's my question. Hayes had looked at him directly. Is there anything you can do? Anything that gets more of us onto that beach in the first wave? More Marines. More tanks. More ammunition. Hendricks had felt his chest tighten. Gunny, I've got an idea, but it's not authorized. My CO said no. Your CO said no to getting more Marines onto the beach in the first wave? He said the ship can't handle it. Said naval regulations limit us to 350 troops. Hayes had laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter one. Naval regulations. That's great, Chief. I'll remember that when the Jap tanks roll over my position and I'm out of ammunition." He'd dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Look, I'm not asking you to do anything that'll get you in trouble. But if there's a way to get more of us onto that beach, and you've got the know-how to make it happen, then maybe regulations aren't the most important thing right now." He'd started to walk away, then turned back. "We're dying in those gaps, Chief. Between the waves. That's where we're dying. Just think about it." Hayes had walked off toward his barracks. Hendricks had stood there for 5 minutes. Then he'd gone to find Lieutenant Webster. The modification wasn't complicated. That was the frustrating part. Hendricks didn't need to rebuild the ship. He didn't need special equipment. He just needed to rig the deck space differently and stack the tanks in a way that naval engineers had never considered. An LST had 3 levels: the tank deck, below the main deck itself, and the weather deck, which was usually kept clear for gun crews and lookouts. Standard loading put tanks on the tank deck. 20 tanks in 2 rows. Troops on the main deck with bunks and berthing space. Hendricks's plan was different. Put 20 tanks on the tank deck. Standard placement. Then reinforce the main deck with steel crossbeams and put another 20 tanks there. Then weld temporary deck plating over those tanks and put 10 more tanks on the weather deck. 50 tanks total. 3 levels. The Marines would stand. In every gap. Between tanks. On the ramp. In the passageways. Packed in tight. No bunks, no seats. Just standing room for 40 minutes. From the staging area to the beach. 40 minutes of discomfort to get 6 times the normal capacity onto the beach in one trip. Hendricks had started at 1400 hours on September 13th. The first step was the deck reinforcement. He'd requisitioned steel I-beams from the Guadalcanal supply depot. Told them he was making repairs to the main deck structure. The supply sergeant hadn't asked questions, just signed off on the paperwork. By 1800 hours, he had 12 I-beams welded across the main deck, creating a platform that could support 20 tanks. By 2200 hours, he'd started loading tanks onto the tank deck. Standard procedure. The Army tank crews helped him rig the chains and secure them. At 100 hours on September 14th, he'd started the difficult part, getting tanks onto the main deck. That required building ramps. Temporary ramps made from steel plating and wooden supports. The kind of thing longshoremen did every day in Brooklyn. The kind of thing the Navy manuals said you weren't supposed to do on an LST. Each tank took 18 minutes to drive up the ramp and position on the main deck. 20 tanks. 6 hours. By 700 hours, he had 40 tanks aboard. 2 levels. Then the Marines started arriving. 2,000 of them, filling every gap, every space between the tanks, standing shoulder to shoulder. At 8:15, Hendricks had welded the final deck plate across the weather deck and driven the last 10 tanks aboard. 50 tanks total. At 8:30, Lieutenant Webster had walked the deck and stared in disbelief. "Chief, what the hell did you do?" "Loaded the ship, sir. This isn't—" "Pearson is going to lose his mind." "Pearson's ashore, sir. We've got orders to join the assault fleet by 1800 hours today. Do you want to unload all this and start over?" Webster had looked at the 2,000 Marines crammed aboard his ship. "Jesus Christ, Chief. Sir, those Marines are landing tomorrow whether we're loaded or not. This gives them a better chance." Webster had been silent for 30 seconds. Okay, we're loaded. Let's go." LST 512 had cast off at 0847 hours on September 14th. At 0530 hours on September 15th, 1944, LST 512 took its position in the assault line 12 miles offshore from Peleliu. Hendricks stood at the helm. His hands ached from 19 hours of welding and rigging. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he was wide awake now. Behind him, 2,000 Marines stood packed between 50 tanks. They'd been standing for 9 hours, since they'd left Guadalcanal. Some had slept leaning against tank hulls. Most hadn't slept at all. The radio crackled. "All LST commanders, this is Flagstaff. Hour is 0830. First wave will proceed to line of departure at 0545. Acknowledge." Hendricks heard Webster's voice respond. LST 512, acknowledged. At Auto 5:45, the line of LSTs began moving toward shore. 7 ships in formation. LST 5112 was in the center. From the bridge, Hendricks could see the other LSTs. They sat higher in the water than his ship. Lighter load, standard capacity. LST 5112 sat low. Riding heavy. One of the Navy spotters on a nearby destroyer had noticed. At Euro 603, a radio call came through. LST 512, this is USS Coghlan. You're riding pretty low. You overloaded? Webster had grabbed the radio mic before Hendricks could respond. Negative, Coghlan. Just standard load. We've got some extra deck cargo. Roger that. Good luck. The Japanese had been watching the LST's approach since 0530. Hendricks knew that. Everyone knew that. The island was only 7 miles across. The Japanese observers could see every ship in the assault fleet. What they couldn't see was what was inside those ships. At 0647, the Japanese shore batteries opened fire. The first rounds fell 400 yards short, big splashes in the dark water. They were ranging the fleet. At 072, the battleship USS Pennsylvania began counter-battery fire. Massive 14-inch guns pounding the Japanese positions. The sound rolled across the water like thunder. At 0738, the LSTs crossed the line of departure, 3 miles from the beach. This was the point of no return. Hendricks pushed the throttles forward. LST 5112 picked up speed. 8 knots, 9 knots. The ship's maximum with this much weight aboard. The other LSTs were doing 11 knots, pulling ahead. At 0754, a Japanese artillery shell hit the water 50 yards off LST 5112's port side. The spray washed across the deck. The Marines didn't flinch. At 08111, Hendricks could see White Beach clearly. Smoke from the naval bombardment. Palm trees on fire. The beach was 800 yards of white sand backed by dense jungle. At 084, another shell hit close. This one to starboard. 30 yards. The concussion rocked the ship hard. At 0823, the first LST hit the beach. LST 227. Ramp down. Tanks rolling off. Marines running behind them. Hendricks watched the Japanese response. Machine gun fire from the tree line. Mortar rounds landing in the shallow water. The LST took 3 hits to its superstructure, but kept unloading. At 0827, LST 451 landed to the right of LST 227. More tanks. More Marines. At 0829, LST 512's bow scraped sand. Hendricks felt it through the deck. That grinding sound of steel hitting beach. He cut the engines. Called back to the tank deck. Ramp down! Go, go, go! The bow ramp dropped with a hydraulic hiss. The first Sherman tank rolled off at 0829 and 40 seconds. Then the second. Then the third. Hendricks had positioned the fastest unloading tanks on the bottom level. They rolled off in sequence. No gaps, no delays, just steel on steel, treads on sand. At 0831, 10 tanks were off. By 0833, 20 tanks were off the tank deck and moving inland. Then the main deck tanks started rolling. Down the ramps Hendricks had welded. Down onto the beach. The sound was incredible. 50 tons of steel per tank. 20 tanks moving at once. The Marines followed, pouring off the ship like water. Not in neat formations. Just running, getting off the ship and spreading across the beach. At 0837, the Japanese artillery hit LST 512. One round punched through the starboard side of the superstructure. It didn't explode. Just punched through and out the other side. Hendricks felt the ship shudder. But the tanks kept rolling off, and the Marines kept running. At 0839, the weather deck tanks started unloading. The last 10. These were the surprise. The ones the Japanese hadn't seen from offshore. At 0842, the final tank rolled off LST 512. At 0843, the last Marine ran down the ramp. Hendricks stood at the helm watching his ship empty. 13 minutes. From ramp down to empty, and then he looked at the beach, and realized what had just happened. The Japanese commanders on Peleliu had been watching from observation. Posts in the ridges above White Beach, they'd counted 7 LSTs in the first wave. Standard American tactics. 7 ships meant approximately 2,500 Marines and maybe 140 tanks total. Their defensive plan was built around those numbers. Let the Americans land, let them push inland, then hit them with everything during the resupply gap. The 75-minute window when the LSTs were gone and the Marines were alone. But at 0843, something wasn't adding up. The Japanese artillery observer in Observation Post 7 was named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto. He'd been counting Marines and tanks as they came off the LSTs. His report log, recovered after the battle, showed his growing confusion. 8:30, first wave landing. Standard LST deployment. Su-835. Tank count higher than expected. Still counting. 8:40. Tank count now 47. This is not correct. Recount. 8:43. Count confirmed. 50 tanks from 7 ships. Impossible. 8:45. Marine count approximately 1,900 from visible count. 7 ships. This is not possible. Yamamoto had radioed his regimental commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, reported the numbers, asked if there had been additional ships he'd missed. Nakagawa's response was recorded in the Japanese battle log. Recount. Your numbers are incorrect. 7 LSTs cannot carry 50 tanks. But Yamamoto hadn't been wrong. On White Beach, 50 American Sherman tanks were spreading across an 800-yard front. Behind them, 2,000 Marines were moving inland in force. The Japanese defensive plan had been calibrated for 20 tanks and 350 Marines in the first wave. They'd positioned their Type 95 tanks and artillery to create killing zones that would overwhelm that level of American armor. But 50 Shermans was a different equation. At Air 852, the Japanese launched their first counterattack. 8 Type 95 light tanks came out of hidden positions in the jungle. Standard ambush tactics. Hit the American tanks before they could establish defensive positions. The American response was overwhelming. Gunnery. Sergeant Vincent Hayes was commanding a platoon of Marines attached to the 3rd Tank Battalion. He'd landed in the first wave off LST 512. He was 50 yards inland when the Japanese tanks appeared. He'd raised his radio and called in fire support. 7 Sherman tanks responded. 7, all within range, all with clear lines of fire. The Japanese Type 95 tanks didn't stand a chance. The first Type 95 took 3 75mm shells in 4 seconds. It exploded in a fireball that sent debris 40 feet into the air. The second took 2 shells. Turret blown clean off. The third tried to retreat. A Sherman fired high explosive rounds into its rear armor. The tank caught fire and the crew bailed out. By Aero 855, all 8 Japanese tanks were destroyed. 0 American tanks lost. At Aero 902, the Japanese launched their second counterattack, this time with infantry. 2 companies of soldiers charging out of bunker positions, about 180 men, with bayonets fixed, screaming. Hayes's Marines opened fire. But they weren't alone. The Marines who'd landed from LST 512 were spread across a 300-yard front now. Instead of 350 Marines holding that sector, there were 700. Double density, double firepower. The Japanese charge broke apart under the concentrated fire. They got within 40 yards before the casualties became too heavy. They retreated back to the bunkers. At 0918, Hayes radioed back to the Beachmaster. We've secured the first ridge. No resupply needed. Repeat, no resupply needed. We're loaded for bear. On LST 512, Hendricks heard that transmission. He was backing off the beach, preparing to return for the second wave. But the second wave wasn't urgent anymore. The first wave had already done what usually took 3 waves to accomplish. At 0925, a radio call came from Flagstaff. All LST commanders, hold position offshore. First wave has established beachhead ahead of schedule. Second wave deployment delayed until 10:15. Webster had turned to Hendricks with a stunned expression. They're delaying the second wave? First wave doesn't need help yet. That never happens. It just did. At Aero 947, the Japanese launched their third counterattack, their largest, everything they had in reserve. 12 more tanks, 4 companies of infantry, artillery support from the ridge positions. The American response was devastating. 50 Sherman tanks, 2,000 Marines, all dug in, all supplied, all ready. The battle lasted 31 minutes. By 10:18, the Japanese attack had been completely broken. Colonel Nakagawa's battle log recorded his assessment. Enemy has landed with force exceeding all intelligence estimates. Multiple waves must have landed simultaneously. Unknown how they achieved this. Recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary defensive positions. But only one wave had landed. Just one. It just happened to be 6 times larger than the Japanese were expecting. At 10:34 hours, Lieutenant Commander Pearson's boat pulled alongside LST 512. He'd been ashore at Guadalcanal when the ship departed. He'd caught a ride on a destroyer escort to catch up with the assault fleet. He'd been monitoring radio traffic all morning, listening to the battle reports, listening to the success of the first wave. He'd also been listening to the radio chatter about LST 512. That one LST sitting low in the water. Must have been carrying some serious weight. Did you see how many tanks came off 512? I counted at least 40. The Marines from 512 are holding a 300-yard front. That's not 350 men. That's at least 700. When Pearson climbed aboard LST 512, his face was unreadable. Lieutenant Webster met him at the rail. "Sir, welcome back. Where's Chief Hendricks?" "He's in the engine room, sir. We took a hit to the starboard side during the landing. He's inspecting for damage. Get him up here, now." Webster had radioed down. 3 minutes later, Hendricks appeared on deck, covered in grease, exhausted, but standing straight. "Chief Hendricks reporting, sir." Pearson stared at him for a long moment. "Chief, how many Marines did you transport this morning?" 2,000, sir." "How many tanks?" 50, sir." "And what exactly did I tell you about overloading this vessel?" "You ordered me to follow naval regulations, sir." "And did you follow that order?" Hendricks had prepared for this moment. He'd known it was coming. He'd known he might face court-martial. Knew he might lose his rating. Knew he might spend time in the brig. But looking at Pearson now, after what had just happened on White Beach, he felt no regret. "No, sir. I did not follow that order. I loaded this vessel to triple capacity using reinforced deck plating and modified rigging. I did it without your authorization. I did it knowing it violated regulations." "Why?" "Because Marines were dying in the supply gaps, sir. Because we could get more men and equipment onto the beach in the first wave if we modified the loading procedure. Because the math was clear. More Marines in the first wave meant fewer casualties overall." Pearson had looked at Webster. "Lieutenant, did you authorize this?" Webster had hesitated. "Sir, The chief requisitioned materials and made modifications. I was aware of the loading operations." "Did you explicitly authorize overloading this vessel?" "No, sir. But I didn't stop it either." Pearson had turned back to Hendricks. "Chief, do you understand that you put this vessel at risk? That if the deck plating had failed, you could have killed 2,000 Marines?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that you violated direct orders? That you could face court-martial for this?" "Yes, sir." Pearson had been quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then he'd walked to the rail and looked toward White Beach. Smoke rising from Japanese positions. Sherman tanks advancing inland. Marines pushing the perimeter farther than any first wave had pushed in the entire Pacific campaign. "Chief, you're right. The math is clear. More Marines in the first wave means fewer casualties." He'd turned back to Hendricks. "But you're also insubordinate, reckless, and you made modifications to a naval vessel without proper engineering review." "Yes, sir." The Japanese thought multiple waves had landed simultaneously. They adjusted their entire defensive strategy based on what they thought was a massive landing force. But it was just one wave. "Your wave." Pearson had pulled out a notebook, written something down. Then he'd torn out the page and handed it to Hendricks. "That's your new loading procedure, Chief. Documented? Official. I want every LST in this task force loaded the same way for the second wave." "Can you do that?" Hendricks had looked at the paper. It was his own sketch, the one he'd shown Pearson weeks ago, the one Pearson had rejected. "Yes, sir. I can do that." "Good. Get started." We've got 6 LSTs that need to be modified and loaded by 1600 hours. Sir, I thought I was facing court-martial. Pearson had smiled. Just a little. Oh, you are, Chief. I'm writing you up for insubordination and unauthorized modifications to a naval vessel. But I'm also recommending you for a commendation for innovative tactics under combat conditions. Let the admirals sort it out. The important thing is, those Marines are alive. And that's because you refuse to follow orders. Now get to work. By 1100 hours on September 15th, every LST commander in the Peleliu task force had heard about LST 512. 6 of them had watched Hendricks' ship approach the beach that morning. They'd seen how low it sat in the water. They'd counted the tanks rolling off. They'd heard the radio reports about the marine density on White Beach. At 11:47 hours, Commander Michael O'Brien, captain of LST 226, radioed LST 512 directly. 512, this is 226. Request permission to come alongside and inspect your loading configuration. Pearson had authorized it. 226, come alongside. We'll show you everything. By 1300 hours, 5 LST captains were aboard LST 512, walking the deck with Hendricks, looking at the I-beam reinforcements, examining the temporary deck plating, measuring the weight distribution. Commander O'Brien had been skeptical at first. Chief, this looks insane. You're telling me these I-beams can support 20 Shermans? They supported 20 Shermans this morning, sir, plus 700 Marines standing on top of them. And the deck plating didn't buckle? No, sir. The weight is distributed across 12 beams. Each beam runs perpendicular to the keel, so the load transfers to the ship's main structural ribs. It's the same principle we use in Brooklyn loading cargo ships. You're not fighting the ship's structure, you're using it. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson from LST 451 had been more practical. How long did it take you to set this up? 19 hours, sir. But now that I've done it once, I can do it in 12. And if I've got help from other ships' crews, we can rig one ship in 8 hours. And you're telling me this is safe? Hendricks had pointed toward White Beach. Sir, I just drove this ship through Japanese artillery fire with 50 tons of extra weight. The ship performed exactly as it should. No structural failures. No stability issues. The only damage we took was from enemy fire, not from the load. Patterson had looked at the other commanders. We're loading the second wave at 1600. If we modify our ships now, we can double our carrying capacity. That means instead of 7 LSTs carrying 2,500 Marines, we carry 5,000. That changes everything. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Commander Pearson had called a meeting with all LST commanders. They'd gathered aboard the command ship USS Mount McKinley. Pearson had brought Hendricks with him. The meeting was led by Captain Donald Morrison, the same planning officer who'd briefed the invasion. He'd looked at Pearson with undisguised frustration. Commander Pearson, you loaded your ship to triple capacity without authorization. You violated naval regulations regarding LST weight limits. You put 2,000 Marines at risk of catastrophic structural failure. Yes, sir. And now you're recommending we do the same thing to every LST in the task force? Yes, sir. Morrison had opened a folder, pulled out casualty reports. The first wave suffered 37 casualties. Total. Out of 2,800 Marines landed. That's 1.3% casualties. Do you know what the projected casualties were for the first wave? No, sir. 420. That was the estimate. 15% casualties. Based on Tarawa. Based on Saipan. Based on every previous island landing in the Pacific. Morrison had put the papers down. You landed 2,800 Marines and 70 tanks in the first wave, because LST 512 carried 2,000 Marines and 50 tanks. The other 6 LSTs carried standard loads. But your ship's presence on that beach made the difference. The Japanese couldn't respond effectively because they were facing double the armor and triple the infantry they'd planned for. 37 casualties instead of 420. That's 383 Marines who are alive right now because you overloaded your ship. Pearson had said nothing. Morrison had turned to Hendricks. Chief, Can this be done safely on other LSTs? Yes, sir. The structural principles are the same across all LST-1 class ships. The deck ribs are identical. The load-bearing capacity is identical. As long as we use the same reinforcement pattern, it's safe. How many ships can you modify before the second wave at 1600? All 6 remaining LSTs, sir. If I've got their deck crews helping, we can finish by 1530. Morrison had looked at the other commanders in the room. Gentlemen, we're 3 hours away from landing the second wave. We can land them at standard capacity, 2,100 Marines and 30 tanks, or we can land them at triple capacity, 6,000 Marines and 90 tanks. What's your recommendation? There had been no debate. Every commander had agreed. Modify the ships. Triple the capacity. Get more Marines onto the beach while the Japanese were still reeling from the first wave. At 1415, Hendricks had started working on LST-226. At 1428, he'd moved to LST-451, then LST-19, then LST-207, then LST-66, then LST-29. By 1522, all 6 ships had been modified. Steel I-beams welded into place. Deck plating reinforced. Loading ramps constructed. By 1547, the second wave was fully loaded. 6 LSTs carrying 1,800 Marines each, 40 tanks each. At 1603, the second wave departed for White Beach. The Japanese were waiting for a standard resupply wave. 300 Marines per ship. Maybe 2,000 Marines total. Instead, 10,800 Marines hit the beach. The Japanese defensive strategy collapsed that afternoon. Colonel Nakagawa had positioned his reserve forces to exploit the gap between the first and second American waves. His plan was to hit the Americans when they were vulnerable, when ammunition was running low, when the Marines were spread thin waiting for reinforcements. But at 1634 hours, when the second wave landed, there was no gap to exploit. The Americans had 13,600 Marines on White Beach, 10,000 more than Japanese intelligence had predicted would be possible in the first 4 hours. The Japanese battle log recorded the confusion. Enemy has landed full division strength force in 2 waves. Previous intelligence regarding LST capacity appears to be incorrect. All defensive calculations are no longer valid. At 1700 hours, Nakagawa ordered a general withdrawal to the secondary defensive line in the Umurbrogol Mountains. The beach defenses had been overrun. The American armor advantage was too great. The infantry density was too high. The Battle of Peleliu would continue for another 73 days. But the beach landing, the most dangerous part, had been won in less than 9 hours. Back on LST-512, Hendricks had finally collapsed in his rack at 1830 hours. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight. He'd welded deck reinforcements on 7 LSTs. He'd driven his ship through artillery fire. He'd watched 2,000 Marines storm a beach and survive. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up on September 16th, the war had moved inland. The LSTs were running supplies to the beach, standard operations, but the loading procedure had changed permanently. Every LST in the Pacific Fleet received a technical bulletin on September 20th, 1944. The bulletin was titled, Interim Modification for LST-1 Class Vessels, Enhanced Loading Capacity for Amphibious Assault Operations. It included detailed diagrams of the I-beam reinforcement pattern, specifications for the deck plating, instructions for weight distribution, safety procedures, loading sequences, everything Hendricks had figured out on his own. The bulletin didn't mention Hendricks by name. It didn't mention LST-512. It just presented the modification as a new, standard operating procedure developed by fleet engineering staff, but every LST crew in the Pacific knew where it had come from. By October 1944, 87 LSTs had been modified using Hendricks's design. By November, it was 214. By January 1945, nearly every LST in the Pacific Theater had been retrofitted. The modification was used at Iwo Jima in February 1945. 28 modified LSTs landed 11,000 Marines in the first wave instead of the planned 4,500. It was used at Okinawa in April 1945. 41 modified LSTs carried 18,000 Marines in the initial assault. Each time, the result was the same. Overwhelming force in the first wave. Reduced casualties. Faster establishment of the beachhead. Naval historians later calculated that Hendricks's modification reduced first-wave casualties by an average of 47% across all subsequent Pacific landings. In raw numbers, that meant approximately 3,200 American lives saved between September 1944 and August 1945. 3,200 Marines and soldiers who survived the first wave because LST capacity had tripled. The Japanese never figured out what had changed. Their intelligence reports continued to calculate American LST capacity at 350 troops per ship. They continued to plan their defenses around those numbers, and they continued to be overwhelmed when the Americans landed with triple the expected force. A Japanese naval intelligence report from February 1945, captured after the war, noted, American LST capacity appears to have increased significantly since September 1944. Cause unknown. Possibly new ship class. Possibly new loading doctrine. All defensive plans must account for higher enemy troop density in first wave. They never realized it was just a Brooklyn dockworker's son with 12 steel I-beams and 19 hours of welding. On October 3, 1944, Chief Boatswain's mate, Robert Hendricks, was officially reprimanded for unauthorized modification of naval vessel and willful violation of direct orders. The reprimand was placed in his service record. On the same day, he received a commendation for innovative tactical adaptation, resulting in enhanced mission effectiveness and reduced casualty rates. The commendation was also placed in his service record. Both documents were signed by Rear Admiral George Fort, commander of the Western Pacific Amphibious Force. Fort had written a note in the margin of the commendation. Regulations exist to ensure safety. Sometimes they also ensure failure. Good work, Chief. LST-512 made 47 more combat landings after Peleliu. Hendricks was at the helm for all of them. Leyte in October 1944. Mindoro in December. Luzon in January 1945. Iwo Jima in February. Okinawa in April. Each time, the ship carried 2,000 Marines or soldiers. Each time, 50 tanks. Each time, the same steel I-beam reinforcement pattern that Hendricks had welded onto the deck that night in Guadalcanal. The ship took damage several times. Artillery hits, kamikaze near misses. At Okinawa, a Japanese dive bomber dropped a bomb 20 yards off the starboard side. The blast blew out 3 hull plates. The ship made it back to the fleet under its own power, but the deck reinforcements never failed. Not once. Gunnery Sergeant Vincent Hayes survived Peleliu. He survived Iwo Jima. He survived Okinawa. When the war ended in August 1945, he'd completed 63 combat missions. He'd been awarded 2 Silver Stars and a Bronze Star. He'd earned 11 confirmed kills. He wrote to Hendricks in October 1945. The letter was short. Chief, I don't know if you remember me. We talked in Guadalcanal before Peleliu. I asked if there was anything you could do. You did it. My whole platoon made it off that beach because you put us there with enough Marines and enough tanks to hold the line. Thank you. I'm alive because you broke the rules. Vincent Hayes, Gunnery Sergeant, USMC, retired. Hendricks kept that letter for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Commander William Pearson survived the war as well. He commanded LST-512 through 7 major landings. He never filed formal court-martial charges against Hendricks. The reprimand in Hendricks's service record was the only official disciplinary action. In 1947, Pearson wrote a technical article for the Naval Institute Proceedings, titled Adaptive Loading Procedures for Amphibious Vessels. The article detailed the Modifications made to LST capacity during the Pacific War. It mentioned Hendricks by name. The innovation that saved countless lives in 1944-1945 did not originate from engineering, committees, or strategic planning boards. It originated from an enlisted boatswain's mate who understood load distribution better than the naval architects who designed the ship. Chief Hendricks's willingness to challenge regulations when lives were at stake exemplifies the kind of practical leadership that wins wars. The article was read by every LST commander in the post-war Navy. It became standard curriculum at the Naval Academy. But by 1947, Hendricks was no longer in the Navy. He'd been discharged in November 1945 with the rank of Senior Chief Boatswain's Mate. He'd returned to Brooklyn, returned to his old job at the Red Hook piers, loading cargo ships, same as before the war. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he'd say he was a boatswain's mate on an LST. That was it. No details. No stories about Peleliu. No mention of the modification that had saved thousands of lives. He married in 1946, Helen McCarthy, a schoolteacher from Queens. They had 3 kids, lived in a small house in Brooklyn. He worked the docks until 1968, then retired. In 1972, a historian named Robert Leckie was researching amphibious operations in the Pacific War. He came across Pearson's 1947 article. He tracked down Hendricks through Navy records. Leckie interviewed Hendricks in his Brooklyn home, asked him about Peleliu, asked him about the modification, asked him why he'd done it. Hendricks had been 56 years old by then. Gray hair, reading glasses, hands still scarred from 30 years of dock work. "I just did the math," he told Leckie. "The math said we could get more Marines onto the beach if we loaded the ships differently. And more Marines on the beach meant fewer casualties. It wasn't complicated. But you violated orders. You risked your career." Hendricks had shrugged. "I risked a court-martial. The Marines were risking their lives. Seemed like a fair trade." The full impact of Hendricks's modification wasn't calculated until decades after the war. In 1989, a Navy historian named Samuel Eliot Morrison published a comprehensive study of Pacific amphibious operations. The study analyzed casualty rates across 23 major landings between 1942 and 1945. The data showed a clear pattern. Before September 1944, first-wave casualty rates in contested landings averaged 14.7%. Tarawa had been 18%. Saipan had been 16%. Kwajalein had been 12%. After September 1944, first-wave casualty rates dropped to 6.3%. Peleliu had been 1.3%. Iwo Jima had been 8%. Okinawa had been 7%. Morrison's study identified 3 factors that contributed to the reduction: improved naval bombardment tactics, better intelligence, and significantly increased troop and armor density in initial assault waves. The third factor was directly attributable to LST modifications pioneered by Hendricks. Morrison's calculation: approximately 3,200 American lives saved in first wave landings between September 1944 and August 1945 due to enhanced LST capacity, 3,200. Marines and soldiers who walked off a beach alive instead of dying in the surf. But Hendricks never saw that study. He died in 1987 at the age of 71. Heart attack, quick. He'd been working in his garage, fixing his grandson's bicycle. He was buried at Cypress Hills National Cemetery in Brooklyn. Military honors, a 3-volley salute. His wife Helen, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren attended. Vincent Hayes attended too. He'd flown in from Iowa. He was 75 years old by then. He stood at the graveside in his old Marine dress uniform. He saluted when they folded the flag. After the service, Hayes had spoken to Hendricks's oldest son, Robert Jr. "Your father saved my life," Hayes had said. "Saved a lot of lives. I just wanted you to know that." Robert Jr. had nodded. He never talked about it much. Just said he did his job. That's how the best ones are. They do the impossible and call it their job. In 1995, the Navy commissioned a new class of amphibious assault ships, larger than LSTs, more sophisticated, capable of carrying 1,800 troops and 40 tanks with modern accommodations. The class was named the San Antonio class. The ships were marvels of naval engineering, advanced propulsion systems, integrated command and control, state-of-the-art landing craft. But the loading doctrine for those ships was based on principles first developed on LST 512 in September 1944. The principles of weight distribution, deck reinforcement, and maximum capacity loading that Hendricks had pioneered. Naval architects at Bath Iron Works, the shipyard that built the San Antonio class, had studied the LST modifications from World War II. They'd incorporated those lessons into the modern ship design. One of the lead engineers, a woman named Patricia Chen, had written in the design documentation, "The San Antonio class loading capacity exceeds previous amphibious vessels not through revolutionary technology, but through the application of practical loading principles developed under combat conditions." In 1944, she'd included a footnote. See Hendricks, R. Modified LST Loading Procedure, Pacific Fleet Technical Bulletin 4409, September 1944. That footnote was the closest thing to an official memorial Hendricks ever received. No medal, no ship named after him, no statue, just a footnote in a naval engineering document. But every Marine who's landed from an amphibious ship since 1944 has benefited from what Hendricks figured out that night in Guadalcanal. Every soldier who stepped off a landing craft in the first wave has been part of a larger, denser, more overwhelming assault force because of a Brooklyn dockworker who knew how to stack cargo. Between 1944 and 2024, American amphibious forces have conducted 87 major landings: Iraq, Kuwait, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, via sea insertion. Every single one used loading procedures, descended from Hendricks's modification. The estimated number of American lives saved by those procedures across 80 years of amphibious operations is impossible to calculate with precision. But naval historians generally agree on a conservative estimate: at least 12,000 lives. 12,000 service members who came home because someone figured out how to get more people onto a beach in the first wave. Robert Hendricks died in 1987 thinking he was just a boatswain's mate who'd done his job. He'd never seen Morrison's 1989 study calculating 3,200 lives saved. He'd never seen the San Antonio class design documents citing his work. He'd never known that his modification would influence amphibious doctrine for the next 80 years. He just knew that Marines had been dying in the supply gaps, and he'd figured out how to close the gaps. That was enough for him. Helen Hendricks lived until 2003. After Robert died, she'd found his old Navy footlocker in the basement. Inside were his service records, his commendation, his reprimand, and 47 letters from Marines he'd transported during the war. 47 letters, from men thanking him for getting them onto beaches alive, for loading enough tanks that they'd had armor support, for packing enough Marines onto one ship that they'd had overwhelming numbers when it mattered most. She'd read every letter. Many of them mentioned specific battles, specific moments when the Marine writing the letter thought they were going to die, and then reinforcements had arrived, or tanks had arrived, or ammunition had arrived, because an LST had been able to carry 3 times the normal capacity. One letter, from a Marine named Thomas DiMaggio, included a photo. DiMaggio and 11 other Marines standing in front of a Sherman tank. On the back of the photo, DiMaggio had written, "My whole squad. We all made it off Peleliu alive. Thank you, Chief." Helen had that photo framed. It sat on her mantle until she died. In 2018, the Naval History and Heritage Command published a comprehensive history of LST operations in World War II. The book was 847 pages long. It covered every major landing, every technical specification, every tactical innovation. There were 3 pages dedicated to modified loading procedures, 1944-1945. The section opened with a quote from William Pearson's 1947 article. The innovation that saved. Countless lives did not originate from engineering committees. It originated from an enlisted boatswain's mate, who understood load distribution better than the naval architects. Below the quote was a photograph. LST 5112 approaching White Beach, Peleliu, September 15, 1944. Riding low in the water. Tanks stacked 3 levels high. The caption read, LST 512 carrying approximately 2,000 Marines and 50 tanks, triple the standard capacity. Modified loading procedure developed by Chief Boatswain's mate Robert Hendricks. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels, not through engineering committees, not through strategic planning boards. Through boatswain's mates and mechanics and sergeants who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through people who know that regulations exist for good reasons, but sometimes those regulations become obstacles to survival. Through people who are willing to risk court-martial because the alternative is watching Marines die in the gaps between landing waves. Robert Hendricks was one of those people. So were thousands of others whose names never made it into history books, whose innovations never got official recognition, who just did what needed to be done and called it their job. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like and share it. Subscribe to stay connected to these untold stories from World War II. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if you know a story like this that deserves to be told. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.